The first thing my mother said when I walked into the kitchen was, "Where is the money?" I stopped with my keys still in my hand. My parents were sitting at the table, my older brother Ryan beside them, and nobody looked surprised to see me. That was what made my stomach tighten. They had already decided something. I just didn't know what. "What money?" I asked. Dad pushed a yellow envelope across the table. It was empty. "The $6,000 from the basement safe," he said. "It was there yesterday." I stared at him. "Why would I take $6,000 from you?" Ryan leaned back and crossed his arms. "Because you were the only one here Saturday." That was technically true. I had stopped by to help Dad move some boxes after his knee started bothering him. I had spent maybe 40 minutes in the basement, then left. But Ryan had been there earlier that afternoon. I looked at him. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Mom's voice softened in that way she used when she wanted to sound reasonable while saying something cruel. "We're not accusing you, Michael. We're asking you to be honest." I almost laughed. Almost. For years, that sentence had meant the same thing in our family. Ryan gets the benefit of the doubt, and I get the explanation. When Ryan needed money for his car, Dad called it helping his son get back on his feet. When I needed a loan after my divorce, Dad told me I should learn to manage my life better. I had stopped expecting fairness a long time ago. But being called a thief by my own parents felt different. "I didn't take it," I said. Dad looked disappointed rather than angry. Somehow, that hurt more. "Then tell us who did." I looked at the empty envelope again. "When did you last see the cash?" "Friday night," Dad said. "I counted it myself." "And the safe was locked?" "Yes." Ryan finally spoke. "Michael, just give it back. Nobody wants to make this bigger." I turned toward him. "Give back something I never took?" He shrugged. "Then prove it." That sentence stayed with me as I walked out. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten anyone. I simply went home. But there was one detail they had forgotten. On Saturday, when Dad asked me to carry a box upstairs, I had noticed something strange beside the basement door. A small security camera had been installed on the shelf, pointed directly toward the stairs. Dad had mentioned buying it weeks earlier, but I thought he hadn't set it up. That night, I called him. "Dad, check the camera." There was silence. Then I heard him say, "What camera?" I smiled sadly. "Exactly." I told him not to accuse anyone yet. I wanted him to watch the recording, because if I was right, the person who entered the basement would have nowhere to hide. For once, I wanted truth to speak first. Dad called me the next morning before I had even finished my coffee. His voice sounded different. Not angry. Not disappointed. Nervous. "Michael, the camera was recording," he said. I set my mug down. "Then you know I didn't take the money." He didn't answer immediately. That silence told me more than his words could have. "I saw you go downstairs Saturday," he finally said. "You were carrying the boxes." "Yes. But the recording starts after you left." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Dad explained that the camera had been unplugged sometime after I left, then plugged back in later that evening. My first reaction was relief. My second was something colder. Someone had deliberately removed the camera from the equation. "Did you check the footage before it stopped?" I asked. "Yes. You were there. Then you left. And after that?" "Nothing for almost 3 hours." I leaned back in my chair. "Dad, who else had access to the basement?" He sighed. "Everyone in the family." That answer was true, but not useful. Ryan had a key. Mom had a key. I had one because Dad had given it to me years ago. Then Dad said something that made me sit forward. "Ryan came back Saturday night." I stared at the wall. "Did he tell you that?" "No." I saw his car outside around 8. Did you ask him why? Dad's voice dropped. He said he forgot something. I closed my eyes. For a few seconds, I wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. Ryan had always been reckless with money, but he was still my brother. Then Dad added, Michael, there's something else. He told me Mom had discovered the missing cash Sunday morning, but Ryan had already known the exact amount missing before Mom told anyone. $6,000. Exactly. That bothered me. Not because Ryan knew the money was gone, because he knew the amount. Dad, I said quietly, when did Ryan tell you the amount? Saturday night. My chest tightened. Before Mom found the empty envelope? Yes. I didn't say anything for a while. Dad finally asked, What are you thinking? I'm thinking you should stop talking to everyone about the money. Why? Because whoever took it thinks nobody has evidence. Dad understood immediately. We agreed not to confront Ryan. I wanted to see what he would do next. That evening, I went to my parents' house. Ryan was already there, sitting at the kitchen table like nothing had happened. He looked at me and smiled. You come to return something? I ignored him. Mom watched me carefully. Dad stayed quiet. I placed my phone on the table. I talked to Dad. Ryan's smile disappeared. About what? The camera. His face changed for less than a second. Most people wouldn't have noticed. I did. What camera? He asked. I looked directly at him. The one you unplugged. Ryan laughed, but it sounded forced. You're accusing me again? No, I said. I'm not accusing anybody. I picked up my phone. I'm just waiting to see who gets nervous before I show the evidence. Nobody spoke. Ryan stared at me. Mom looked at Dad. And for the first time since this started, I realized something important. They weren't all on the same side anymore. For the next 2 days, I said nothing about the money. That was harder than I expected. Every time my phone buzzed, I wondered if it was Dad calling to tell me what he had found. Every time I thought about Ryan sitting across from me, pretending not to understand what I meant by the camera, I felt that old anger rising in my chest. But I kept reminding myself of one thing: anger makes people careless, and I needed Ryan to keep talking. On Wednesday evening, Dad called and asked me to come over alone. When I arrived, he was waiting in the garage with the door closed. Your mother doesn't know I called you, he said. What happened? Dad looked exhausted. I checked the bank records. I frowned. What bank records? He explained that the $6,000 had been withdrawn from the family emergency account 2 days before it disappeared from the basement safe. My stomach dropped. Wait, so the cash wasn't originally in the safe? No, I withdrew it Friday afternoon. For what? Dad looked away. Your mother's medical bills and some repairs around the house. I nodded slowly. That explained why the money had been there. But it also meant someone had known about the withdrawal. Who knew you had the cash? I asked. Dad hesitated. Ryan. There it was again. Another piece. But Dad wasn't finished. He handed me a printed bank statement. The withdrawal was highlighted. Ryan came with me to the bank Friday, he said. I didn't think anything of it. He said he needed to pick something up nearby. I stared at the paper. Dad, why didn't you tell me this earlier? Because I was still trying to believe you were wrong about him. I looked at my father. That sentence hurt more than I expected. He wasn't protecting Ryan because he had proof of innocence. He was protecting the version of his son he wanted to believe in. Then Dad pulled out his phone. There's another thing. He showed me a message from Ryan sent Friday night. It said, Dad, don't forget the envelope in the safe. I'll handle the payment Monday. I read it twice. What payment? Dad shook his head. I never asked him to handle anything. Suddenly, the missing $6,000 wasn't just a theft. It looked like Ryan had planned something before the money even disappeared. But I still needed proof that connected him to the actual cash. That was when I remembered something from Saturday. When I had been carrying boxes downstairs, Ryan's old tool bag had been sitting beside the safe. I had thought nothing of it. Now I wondered why it was there. Dad and I went into the basement. The tool bag was still on a shelf. Dad opened it. Inside were screwdrivers, electrical tape, an old flashlight, and a receipt from a hardware store dated Saturday night. The purchase was for a replacement camera cable. I stared at the receipt. Ryan had bought the exact type of cable needed to reconnect Dad's camera. But there was still one problem. None of it proved he took the money. Dad looked at me and whispered, "Michael, what do we do now?" I picked up my phone. "We let him think we still have nothing." Dad looked confused. "Why?" I put the receipt in my pocket. "Because I think Ryan is about to make one mistake he can't explain." The next evening, I asked everyone to come to my parents' house for dinner. Mom seemed confused, Dad looked uncomfortable, and Ryan arrived 20 minutes late with the same careless expression he had worn all week. I didn't tell them why I wanted everyone there. I simply waited until we were seated, then placed a folder on the table. Ryan looked at it and immediately said, "What's that?" "Evidence," I said. Mom's face tightened. Dad stared at the folder. Ryan laughed. "You've been watching too many detective shows." I opened the folder and placed the bank statement in front of him. "Dad withdrew $6,000 Friday afternoon." Ryan shrugged. "Okay." Then I placed his text message beside it. "And Friday night, you reminded Dad about the envelope in the safe." His expression changed. "So? So you knew exactly where the money was?" Ryan leaned back. "That doesn't prove anything." "I agree." I placed the hardware store receipt on the table. "This doesn't prove you took it either." "But you bought a replacement cable for Dad's security camera Saturday night." Mom looked at Ryan. "Why?" "I didn't. I turned the receipt around so he could see the name printed at the top." Ryan stared at it. "That could be anyone. It's your rewards account," I said. "Your name is on it." The room went silent. Ryan looked at Dad. "Dad, seriously?" Dad didn't answer. Ryan's confidence started disappearing. I reached into my folder and pulled out one final page. "You still think I took the money?" Ryan looked at me. "You were the only person in the basement Saturday." "No," I said. "I was the only person you thought was going to be blamed." I showed them the camera footage Dad had recovered from a backup device. The footage wasn't perfect, but it showed Ryan entering the basement Saturday night carrying his tool bag. He looked directly at the camera before unplugging it. Mom covered her mouth. Dad stared at his son. Ryan stood up so quickly that his chair scraped against the floor. "That doesn't show me taking anything." "No," I said calmly. "But this does." I placed a photograph on the table. It showed the inside of Ryan's car, taken by Dad earlier that afternoon after Ryan had borrowed it. In the back seat was the same yellow envelope that had been inside the basement safe. Ryan stared at the photograph. Then he sat down. Nobody spoke. Finally, Dad asked, "Why?" Ryan's eyes filled with tears. He admitted he had taken the money to cover a debt he had hidden from everyone. He had planned to replace it before anyone noticed. When he realized Dad had discovered the missing cash, he panicked and blamed me because he knew the family had always been quicker to question me than him. I listened without interrupting. Mom apologized. Dad did too. But the apology I wanted most wasn't coming from them. It was the apology I owed myself for spending so many years believing I had to prove I deserved to be trusted. I stood up and pushed the evidence back into my folder. I'm not angry that you believed Ryan, I told my parents. I'm hurt that believing me was never your first instinct. Dad lowered his head. I walked out without waiting for another apology. The next morning, Dad called again. This time I answered. He didn't defend Ryan. He didn't make excuses. He simply said, "You were right, son. We should have listened." I closed my eyes. For years, I had wanted my family to finally choose me. But that morning, I realized something better. I didn't need them to choose me anymore. I had finally chosen myself.